Recently, through some casual conversation, we discovered that several interested individuals and parties around Southern Wesleyan University were also podcasters. Their areas of focus were so intriguing that we thought it would be exciting to bring them all together to not only discuss their podcast subjects, but also their inspiration and thoughts on sharing through this popular medium. What you're about to hear is some of the finest people here at SWU sharing their hearts and passions, and you'll definitely want to jump over to their work and listen to what they've been doing. Links to their podcast can be found in the description. We're back with Moments That Matter today with a heavy-hitting lineup of other podcasters. This is the podcast to rule them all. And we've brought together some of our all-time favorite people here at Southern Wesleyan University to share their podcasts and what inspired them. We're going to kick things off with Brent Dongell and Michaela Wickham, who have been working on a Quest podcast. And all of this information, of course, will be linked to the description. But welcome, Brent and Michaela.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
I would love to hear what your inspiration was for this podcast and kind of what direction it's taken as you've begun.
I'll start off in the sense that Michaela and I have both been in leadership over a program at SWU called Quest, where we seek to empower teenagers, especially high school students, towards their call in ministry or in life and their future. So we focus on Bible, culture, and calling. And so we've done that through website and visiting camps and youth groups. But the podcast was a chance to be in students and student leaders' worlds and homes in a different way, which was super exciting. And I when I was leading this before, would have loved to have started this, but kind of all the stars aligned, and that happened within the last year.
Yeah, normally in Quest, we are taking on camps, teaching different curriculum to high school students about Bible, culture, calling, just like Brent said. And we're actually at camp with these students teaching in classrooms. And actually over the past year, what's really kicked off the podcast for Quest is that we couldn't go to camps over the last year. And so to be face-to-face with students was just not an option because of the pandemic that we're facing. And so we're like, what can we do to still be in the ears of these high school students that are wrestling with things in the Bible, things that they're really seeing in our culture that they need to wrestle with? And find biblical answers for, and then still be inspired to the calling that God has placed on them. So how do we get in their ears? How do we help them figure out how to think through what God is doing in their lives? And a podcast was just the right move to make in that moment. And so it was really cool to say, hey, we're still coming to you, students. But it may just be in a different way than normal. And you get to hear from people that we get to see every day at the university, whether that's a student or a professor or somebody in the field living out their calling that God has placed on them. And so it's been a really, really cool opportunity for us to still reach those high school students that maybe we haven't been able to see in a year. And so that's kind of what struck this podcast to begin. And it has been a fun journey with gathering people at the university and all over the place to pour into high school students and help them answer these questions that they're wrestling with.
That's great. And I've been interested at how COVID has sort of forced us into these new avenues of communication. In your mind, has the podcast unfolded as you thought it would? And has it been connecting well with your audience?
Such a great question. And I'll let Michaela answer that more in detail. But within that, I would just say all of the people that we'll be talking through, Heath, whether it's Heath and storytelling and the side with wrestling and other things, or whether it's Paul and the storytelling with Moments That Matter, Deborah and the way that she tells stories, the small and big stories, Scott. We all believe in the power of storytelling and what that can do and how that influences people. And so Quest is amazing because it gives us a chance to interview people, to hear their stories about how God has called and influenced their lives. So for us, there has been an impact just in even recording those stories for students to hear as they're trying to wrestle through all of those topics we've discussed.
Yeah, there's something really special that happens when you turn the microphone on and you just start talking, that things just come out for the people that we're talking to, where they get to like share some really, really hard things that they've wrestled with, but really good things and victories that they've seen God do throughout their time. Just what we're asking them about. It's really cool to see just in that moment people open up and know that what they're saying is going to impact the people that are listening. And so we have been able to impact a ton of high school students all over the place. But we've really, really seen a ton of growth in the people that are podcasting with us. And that's been really cool. And so we do have some listeners. A lot of those are college students, but as well, because they're growing and they're learning too. But there are a good amount of high school students that are listening as well. And it's cool for them. A lot of them are people that we have interacted with over the summer. And they're like, man, we're so glad to like hear these voices that we've heard over the summer too, people that I've interacted with. So yeah, we want to be faithful to just tell the stories. And so whoever listens, whether that's the high school group that we're aiming for, or the college students that share with their friends all over the place, we just want to be faithful to ask questions and share stories.
That's awesome. My guess is that this next question will be answered similarly by everyone. But if someone was interested in starting a podcast, what would be your counsel to them as they get off on their podcasting journey?
I won't talk long because I think there's other experts that will answer that better than me on this podcast. For me, the holdup was simply I needed a team that I knew would be consistent in doing it. So for me, I didn't want to start and do 2 episodes and be done. So a part of that was just strategically wanting to make sure that if I was committed to it, that we would see it through. So as to how to actually start it up, I would say with others, but I was waiting for the team or people that said, no, we're committed to seeing this through before I started.
Yeah, I'm definitely motivated by people coming alongside of me and doing stuff as a team. And so echoing Brent, to have someone to work with, we work on this together. And so to have someone to say, hey, who do we got this week? Let's brainstorm ideas. What kind of questions do we want to ask? What kind of people do we want to have on? To have that, like, that interaction together to be able to make this happen has been really, really good. I would say also just start talking. I had to learn how to do this as I went. And so it was almost like I was building the plane as I was flying it. And so in doing that together, our first podcast, like I'm learning how to edit, I'm learning how to record, and I'm still getting better at that. And so the quality of them continue to increase, but just start talking. Even if you don't know what to talk about, if there's something inside of you or people that you can bring in that can tell a beautiful story and you can just listen to, a lot of what I found that me and Brent get to do is just ask questions, listen, and then ask more questions about that because we're intrigued. And so we hope that our listeners are intrigued. And so bottom line, I'd say just start talking, get yourself recorded, and ask good questions and be curious about what's right in front of you, whether that be the person or the topic. And then you'll learn as you go when it comes to recording and editing and so on and so forth and posting all of that stuff. But start talking, even if that's a voice memo on your phone. Start talking and getting those things recorded because when you externally process things, it's amazing what conclusions you can come to and process them together.
Beautifully said and agreed in every way. Anything else you'd like for listeners to know about your podcast or where things might be heading in the future?
I'll just say this to encourage listeners. This is going back a little ways, but I remember Donald Miller had a book called Scary Close, and a couple comments he made in that were so interesting to me. We just, as we were talking through this, was he mentioned how when someone's getting ready to jump in a pool, sometimes they'll tell you all the sharks or the ocean, all the things that are the dangers of doing it. And he made the comment, there's a lot more lifeguards out there to try and tell you not to go in them than there are actually sharks. And so there's a lot of voices that'll tell you why not to do it and tell you all the dangers of why not to do it. But one of his follow-up comments was simply, what if God intended for the most true version of you to be your gift to the world instead of some mask or something else? So the beauty of podcasts is giving people a chance to actually allow the gifting of who they are and what they're learning to be shared as a gift to the world. And so in that way, I just want to encourage those that are listening and that are thinking about this, man, what Michaela said, echo it. We're learning, but we just want to give, if God's called you to it, just be true to that gift and what God's given you to share that with the people in a vulnerable way that allows us to empower them.
Yeah, Quest is super unique in that you'll hear on the rest of this podcast where each of these other amazing podcasts are coming from, who they're bringing in, who they're talking to, what they're talking about. We are really excited to be talking to high school students or college students about what God can do in their life. And so in bringing in stories and people who have seen what God is doing through the Bible, through their culture, through their callings, whether that be to vocational ministry or not, we're hitting a group that is dreaming for the future. And so what's cool about these other podcasts as well is that they all hit a different group of people. And so we love the lane that we're in. We love encouraging high school students and helping them to dream. And all of these other podcasts are pieces of that as well. And so we love our lane, and we love what we get to encourage high school students with. And so, yeah, if you haven't listened to us, definitely give it a listen. We'd love to see you be encouraged by that.
Yeah, and I just want to echo that we're proud of being a part of this SWU team and the other people are going to share here as we continue on. You guys, we admire all of you guys and what you contribute to the body of Christ in your own unique personal ways.
And let me thank you for putting together some really great content that honestly would have been very meaningful to me in my formative high school years and college years, especially to recognize what a great resource that Quest is and what you guys have been putting out. So well done. For our listeners, that information, again, will be linked in our description, and you can find it there. Let's shift quickly to the possibly youngest but longest planned podcast with Deborah Rose, The Little.
That's it. Yep.
Tell us a little bit about what led you to start this podcast, what went on behind the scenes, no matter how long it might have been.
Yeah. So I've actually been listening to podcasts for a really, really long time. I had an hour-long commute when we lived in Indiana. I would drive from Marion down to Fishers for work 5 days a week. So I had 2 hours in the car. So I was like, podcasts were new. And I just started listening. I love this idea of listening in on people's conversations, but also being able to learn something. And it was one of those things that like over time, it just kind of began to grow. And then like everyone was doing it. And it was like, I think I can do this too. And so about 4 years ago, Heath Mulliken and I started this process, and then life happened and his internet went down, and with it, the podcast, because he was the one doing the recording and like putting it out there and all that stuff, because I'm the kind of person that like, if you tell me I need to learn something new like that technology wise, I'm like, I'm done. So I got really overwhelmed with all of that. And so for that reason, it kind of fizzled out, but it never left. Like the passion and the desire has been there and just growing over the last few years. But I love the idea of sitting down with a microphone, having a conversation, and then putting it out there to encourage or inspire or challenge other people, because it's just a really cool resource that we have, and we have the technology now to do it. It's so much easier than it's ever been. And yeah, I think it's so much fun.
That's awesome. And this is very new, as in days old, sort of the reboot.
Yeah, the reboot, we just hit publish on the trailer yesterday. So wow. It's like 24 hours, literally.
That's awesome.
So yeah, I'm really excited.
Who is your target audience? Who do you hope is listening to the content that you're producing?
You know, I don't know that I really have a target audience. I think sometimes, you know, being a female, like there's this assumption that like my target audience would be female listeners, but I don't necessarily want that to be the case. I want men and women to listen. I want people out of ministry and in ministry to listen. I want moms to listen. I want, you know, people who don't have kids. Just wherever it lands and wherever it hits, like to me, my job in this season with the podcast is to be obedient. And then the results, that's up to the Lord.
That's awesome. I really like what you said. I think you've answered it well. What sort of sparked this interest in podcasting? I have had a commute much like your own from Greenville to SWU for several years before we recently moved. And so it was a good 45, 50 minutes in the car in the mornings and at least an hour in the afternoons. And there's such great content that's available. I think you said it well that after you listen for a certain amount of time, you think, I could do this. And I've got things that are inside that the Lord has placed on my heart that's a burden to me that I can share with his body. What else would you like to share with those who might be listening about your podcast reboot? What direction is it heading? Do you have any big plans, or are there any big giveaways that we need to sign up for? Did I hear mention of a cruise, a free cruise?
That would be fantastic. If anyone would like to sponsor that, I'd be happy to facilitate that. That would increase the follows and subscribes, right? Yeah. So honestly, one of the things that I've noticed in a lot of the podcasts that I listen to is it's typically like the same group of people. And not that that's bad, but like when a person puts out a book or something happens, like that person is on 6 or 7 or 20 different podcasts just because of the circle that I kind of follow. But in looking at the denomination that we're a part of, which I adore, I just like the thought of in this little space, taking the resources that I have, the connections that I have, and connecting people and telling those stories that might not normally get told. And so the tagline is ordinary people, extraordinary stories. And that everyone has an extraordinary story because their stories are being written by the Lord. And so I think that's what makes them exceptional, but we don't always have a place to share that. And my hope is that the Little Space podcast will be a place where people can come in and share their story in a way that they might not have the opportunity to do it somewhere else. And so, I'm really thankful. My husband and I have lived in quite a few different places, and we have some connections really all over the country. And to just kind of tap into that as a resource and say, hey, like, I would love for you to just come on the podcast so people that I know or who are listening to the podcast can know you, because you've got good ideas and you're doing amazing things. And just to make those connections, like that's really part of the heartbeat of it, to help people discover their purpose. It's like Brent and Michaela were saying, like to help stories help people discover their purpose. It's beautiful how that happens. But a lot of times, like in hearing someone's story, it's like it sparks something in someone and they're like, that's what I'm passionate about. And now I have this resource that I can follow and figure out how to do that. Because, as followers of Jesus, we all have one purpose. That's to build the kingdom. That's to go and make disciples. But the way that we get to do that, it gets lived out uniquely in our own God-given purposes for us as an individual through the bigger story. And I think it's just really exciting to get to play maybe hopefully a small part in that, even if it's just that there's a day someone's having a really bad day and the podcast that day brings them some encouragement and gives them some hope. That's part of the story. And if I can live out the bigger purpose in this small way, like that's what I want to do.
Since you did have this great entry into the podcast world 4 years ago, were you ever surprised, or did you ever cross paths with somebody who said they had listened to your podcast and it was maybe with a specific guest, or maybe it was something you said and it really blessed them and you would have never expected that person may have listened? Did you ever have any surprises in the episodes that you put out?
I think that anyone listened was a little bit surprising, but it was funny because when I posted yesterday about the relaunch, I actually had a friend from Indiana who reached out and she was like, I have been waiting for you to do this. Like, I've been waiting for you to relaunch this. And so, I think just that my voice with other people's voices can have any impact on anyone. It always blows my mind because I never feel worthy to do that. But I know it's so much bigger than me. And so for me, this is a walk of obedience. And so yeah, like to me, that anyone listens and gets anything out of it is surprising, because that is probably going to come from the people that I have on the show and not me. But yeah, it's really incredible to hear that encouragement, that it has impacted someone in any kind of way.
Yeah, I think it's so neat. It almost shrinks the distance between individuals, where in a way you get invited into someone's car as they drive, or you get invited in their home as they are cleaning or looking after their kids or doing yard work. And it's just such a great honor that you can run into someone outside of maybe your circle of influence, or in a way that you wouldn't have expected. And there's already been a connection that you didn't know that they had already been listening, or something like that. Anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think, one of the things that held me back for so long was just, like I mentioned, like anything technical, just I am so freaked out about. And so, truthfully, the Anchor app has made the podcast piece, like the recording and the uploading, so easy. And I think if there's anyone out there who's like, I want to, but there's just so many things I don't know, I'm not sure how to edit, like I want it to look this certain way, I think I would say, like, just take the step. And it's so much easier than it's ever been. And to hold back because there's a piece that you aren't sure about, like, don't let that be the excuse. Ask for help, get input. You don't have to do any of this alone, but also I'm my own worst enemy. And I think I would just encourage anyone who has a desire to do something like this, just do it. Just do it. It's so worth it to feel the excitement of like, man, I wanted to do this and now I'm doing it. And so, yeah, I would say, if you need to name what the excuses are, that's fine. And then get past them and just keep going, because God has a purpose for you, and I want to see you fulfill it. So, yeah.
Well said. I think that's going to be a general theme with everyone who has walked through this journey. Just do it and just start. I remember that was the encouragement that was given by our next featured guest, the one and only Heath Mulliken, godfather of the podcasters, the king of podcasters. All of our experience added up and combined would be a fraction of the experience and effort that Heath has put together. Heath, I think you've been podcasting as long as podcasting has existed.
It's been, we were podcasting before podcasting was really a thing. And I started out, first of all, man, thank you guys for pulling this together. What a great group of people. So encouraging, man. So many good things God is doing here at Southern Wesleyan. I actually got invited on the Techology Show by Tony Casey and Matthew T.G. and Steve Stanley at the time. And they just wanted me to come on once a month as a youth ministry expert. And so I was living in North Carolina at the time and would call in, once a month. And they were doing the video production. Dude, they were way ahead of their time. Like, they were doing this before the technology was there to do this. And so when we moved to South Carolina in 2010, I remember going over for my normally scheduled appointment. And I said, hey, could I do this every week? And they're like, yes, please come do this every week. And so it became a weekly thing, and started learning about podcasting. And then that led to a lunch with a childhood friend who we both shared a love of wrestling. And and just then there were starting to be some wrestling podcasts. And he said, we should do a wrestling podcast. I'm like, I think I can do that. And so back then, Deborah talked about the Anchor app. Well, back then there wasn't an Anchor app, and you had to get some sort of equipment, and you had to have some sort of technical expertise to figure that out. And so that was 7 years ago. We've been doing our wrestling podcast. We're coming up on 300 episodes. That led to, okay, if I'm podcasting about this, I've started and stopped a lot of podcasts. Started the Rural Pastor podcast that made it about 5 episodes. I started the Chase Your Lion podcast. I don't know how many episodes that was. And then personally just kind of landed on when my wife was really sick in 2018, I was just like, man, I really want to do my own podcast, but I want it to kind of be about everything. And I just want it to be whatever I want it to be. And so I started the Heath Mulliken Project, and really was going to be a daily journal of what's going on with our family. I had no idea that, less than 3 weeks after I started that podcast, that my wife would pass away. Had no idea. And it has been, it's been on and off over the last couple of years. But when I'm talking to people about podcasting now, I think everybody should have a podcast, because for me, it's therapeutic. It's, I record our wrestling podcast. We have a Patreon, and so people pay and we give them content. And every morning on the way in to work, I record a podcast. and it gets things out of my head, and I can talk about, because listen, the stuff I talk about in wrestling, I'm not exactly going to go down to Dr. Voss's office and talk about the ins and outs of the wrestling business and how do we sell more tickets. But in my car, I can get all these things out of my head. I can close that loop. And then when I get here, I hit the stop button and I'm done, and it's out of my head. And I think even more, so much more important than wrestling, obviously, when I'm able to go through something personally and I'm able to hit that record button. And I was telling Deborah the other day, I'm like, Deborah, most days I hope somebody listens, and I hope it, but it's for me. Like, this is a very selfish thing that I just need, things I need to get off my chest. And part of the Heath Mulligan project, I think now, is I'm going through a lot of personal growth. How do I help people? One thing Deborah's going to help me with is we're actually going to create a podcast course of just, hey, how do you do this? Why should you do this? And this is not a podcast course on this is how you get 1 million downloads and this is how you make it your full-time job. No, it's like, this is how you use a podcast to keep yourself sane and to give yourself your own, to quote my friend, little space to kind of have your own thing. And so very excited about that, because you don't have, the Anchor app, you don't have to have a $200 microphone or a $500 camera. You just got to hit record, and then you got to hit publish. And it's a scary thing, but it's such a, the doors that God has opened through podcasting. It's just, it's pretty ridiculous, both on, a Wesleyan level and on a wrestling level. I would say podcasting really led me here to this position at SWU, because they're like, hey, we really need a SWU podcast. Well, now we got a bunch of SWU podcasts. So, podcasting, I think it's always going to be a part of my life. And I can't imagine going a day without recording something.
That's great counsel. And I think everyone gathered here has benefited and profited directly off of what you have said and the wisdom and the guidance that you've given us, because I don't know that any of us would be here joined together talking about this topic were it not for the great work that you've done, the research that you've done that we've profited off. I'm really excited about this course, podcasting course. That'll be great. I think earlier, maybe 2 years ago, you and I were talking in the parking lot, and you were saying everybody can be recording something. It's easier now than ever. Everybody should be podcasting all the time. And since that time, and since you sort of introduced that mentality, there have been so many that have been planted and have begun growing here. And you were the one that introduced us to Anchor. And I think maybe the biggest stop for people wanting to enter this world is the tech issue, just as Deborah said, and just as Brent and Michaela mentioned. It's just sort of the nuts and bolts of how to make it all happen. And you've made it so easy for us to be able to walk through those doors. And I like what you said about being able to present what's within, and that in a way it's a therapeutic thing, but those who listen also hear things. And it's almost like when you experience something that is a revelatory moment or exciting, you want to share it with somebody and have a conversation with somebody about it. I know one of my favorites, this is just personally, of what you podcast on, is Survivor, because I grew up watching the show, and whenever a new episode would come out of this very last season, it was, man, I'm waiting on Heath to drop his podcast so I can hear what he thinks about this, because I don't really have a big group of people that sit around and talk about Survivor. Right. And so this great moment of connection. So you also mentioned just a second ago, SWU Soul Stories. Tell us a little bit about that podcast.
So there are so many amazing people who are connected to Southern Wesleyan, whose lives were transformed here, who are doing amazing things, and just stories that weren't being told. And so the goal of the podcast was just to tell those stories. We've had several people who have written books. My predecessor, Joy Bryant, just released a book last year. And so to be able to talk to her about that and promote her book and go to the book signing was a pretty cool thing. We've had people educators during the pandemic who have really had to, just step up and kind of, like Michaela said earlier, they're flying the plane while they're putting it together. And so it's been a pretty incredible thing, but it's also a way for me as alumni director to make connections, and not just for me personally, but reconnecting people, all around the world, all around the country with Southern Wesleyan. Speaking of Michaela, she played a really dirty trick on me. So she called me over like just to talk about some tech stuff. And I said, hey, it would be easier if we just recorded something on your equipment. And then, that's easier than me just telling you. And it was amazing because I don't know if she kept this recording or not, but it was like 8 minutes of gold because we started talking about my journey at First Wesleyan because we were sitting. I'm like, oh, your office used to be the workroom. And I just start telling the story. And right there is where Pastor Fred's office was. And that's where the idea of Alive first started. And she's like, I had no idea. And it was just like, again, you just hit record. And who knows, like you can have your notes and all of that, but you just hit record and man, the Lord just works. And Michaela's probably like, what is going on? But it was powerful. Like the Holy Spirit was there in the room. And that's just kind of what happens. And so like, I know like Deborah's going to be taking her phone around and she's going to have these podcasts, scheduled, these interviews scheduled, and she's going to sit down. And I know when we record next week, we're both going to cry. Because it's such a powerful thing.
Yeah, that's what I was saying earlier. Like, you don't know what's going to happen when you turn that mic on. Like, you were just showing me how to do this. You were teaching me how to podcast. And I now work for the same church that, like, we were talking about. But I'm, like, multiple years down the road. And I have no idea how this church got there. But I get to sit and hear your story of, like, how Alive became alive. And that's part of my history that I didn't know about because now I'm serving that same congregation. And so, yeah, wow. God does some cool things when you just open up the conversation like that.
Yeah, I mean, you think about, in 20 years, 30 years, my kids will be able to go, they'll be able to go back, grandkids, if they want to go and listen, they'll be able to, hear my voice. They'll be like, what? Why is Granddad talking about wrestling so much and everything? But it's just a cool thing. I mean, we're trying to put together an oral history of the school, and we have a ton of tapes in the library of old chapels that's going to be, I mean, hundreds of podcast episodes waiting to happen of people's, maybe even my first sermon in chapel from when I was a student. So it's just like this treasure trove of possibilities.
Thanks for listening to Moments That Matter, a podcast that looks at the moments in our lives that come along from time to time that have consequences long after the moment, especially those moments that have to do with the choice of vocation. In his book, Let Your Life Speak, Listening for the Voice of Vocation, Parker Palmer speaks of a clearness committee in the Quaker tradition, wherein a group of older, wiser people ask questions of someone considering a life choice as a way of clarifying the next step. We may not meet with a committee about these big decisions, but we all have these critical junctures in our lives, which we can think of as clearness committee moments. We need to pay attention to these moments because they are profound and potentially life-altering. We'll relay stories from our lives and interview others about theirs, especially noting the clearness committee moments, those we choose to recognize and those that were sadly ignored, those decisions that were made with God in mind and those that were not. Our hope is that these podcasts will cause you to think of the same kind of moments in your life with new clarity.